So now we're at the end of Season 8, with The Demons, a serial which has a reputation as an absolute classic, as the favourite of everyone who worked on it, and seen as one of the highest points of this era of the show. So let's get into this season finale and see if the hype is worth it. So The Demons is one of the most interesting ideas of the show so far, by taking elements of folklore, witchcraft and the devil and turning them into an alien threat, with the titular Daemons being an alien race which advanced Earth's progression as a scientific experiment. So this idea is genius, and while there have been serials which have taken real world or fantasy elements and given them a sci-fi twist before, this serial is the first to go all in on it. So there's a lot to talk about with this one, but let's talk about the setup for the events of the serial. Starting with the setting, that being the village of Devil's End and the Devil's Hump. So the village has a history of witchcraft, with the Devil's Hump being a place of interest due to being believed that there is a tomb under it, but it turns out to be where the demon's spaceship is buried. The majority of the village folk though don't seem to have much interest in the history of witchcraft, with a few exceptions, who are working for the Magister to help him control the daemon, alongside Mrs. Hawthorne, who is a witch. So how the demons play into the witchcraft and history of the folklore of the world is important, and a lot is explained in a single scene by the Doctor, who explains that they were an advanced alien race who, as explained before, advanced Earth as an experiment. As explained, the rituals of witchcraft and in folklore is just the science of the daemons, but given a new meaning by humans. This is a cool way to retroactively introduce aliens into humanity's history. We were really taking advantage of aspects of history to make it fit and give meaning to those things at the same time. Now I will admit this idea does feel like a bit of a backseat thing at times, as it does mostly exist as a plot point so that the story can have the characters performing these rituals and it's summoning a devil-like creature. But even so, it's an interesting idea that the serial does expand on as it goes on. So the demon itself isn't the main villain, instead just the final boss of sorts, with the villain being the Magister, who wants the demon's power for himself. And for anyone who knows their Latin, the Magister is of course the master in disguise. I'll talk about the Master later and instead focus on his cult for a moment. So the Master's cult is made up of people in the village who he convinced to assist him with the rituals to summon the demon. Now having the Master manipulating almost an entire village is interesting. It's mostly done before the story begins, with him having to convince them to help him later by showing them the power he has got from an earlier ritual, that being to animate and control a gargoyle. There isn't really any of the Master using his hypnosis to control people, which is unfortunate, instead it all being due to the power he has over them. The only notable time the Master tries to use his hypnosis is when he's introduced, with him trying to hypnotise Miss Hawthorne, but it doesn't work. The cult itself isn't explored, with it acting far more as a way to set the scene rather than the collective of people themselves. They do try to rebel at one point, but this is when the Master shows them his power and they stay on his side. Now let's talk about the use of units in this serial, as it's a bit different to what we've seen so far, with them mostly being kept out of the action until the end. While Benton and Yates appear throughout, with them going to the village early on, the Brig is kept trapped outside of the area by a heat barrier, with him spending most of his time trying to get past it, which lasts until around halfway through the final episode. This does limit the Brig's involvement, but it works well as to allow the situation to feel far more tense, as the majority of units are stuck outside. The Brig does still get plenty of great moments, usually when things are going wrong with units' attempts to get through the heat barrier, but he also gets one of his most memorable and iconic lines.
Shot for the wings there. 5 rounds rapid.
Benton and Yates are far more useful to the plot, with them both serving as characters who can ask questions alongside getting a lot of action, with Yates really getting the bulk of it. While it is a bit odd that these two are at the forefront instead of the Brig, I think it works to give them more to do and makes them feel far more important than they have so far. I don't think they're used as well as they were in Mind of Evil, but it's something different for them. Yates gets another confrontation with the Master, but it's not as good as in Mind of Evil. But like that time, he does end up as a prisoner until his escape. Although my favourite moment for Yates is when the demon is being summoned for the first time and he's knocking all the furniture over. I know this was meant to look like everything was being shaken, but it's so obvious that he's the one knocking into everything. Benton on the other hand is as good as ever, with him getting to assist in the Doctor's rescue from the townsfolk and showing off his usual comedy throughout, which does allow him to lighten the mood when things are getting more tense. Having these two paired up without the Brig is different, and I do like it, but I do prefer it when Benton's paired up with the Brig. Although the Brigadier and Yates do get one great scene in the serial, with the two of them ad-libbing their final lines.
Fancy a dance, Brigadier?
It's kind of you, Captain Yates. Got all of a pint.
So let's talk about the Daemon itself now, as I've mentioned him a few times but haven't addressed him fully. So the Demon is called Azal, and is the last of the Daemons, with him having landed on Earth thousands of years ago, and since then has been in hibernation in his ship, waiting for humanity to evolve to the point where they can be tested, with him destroying the entire species if they fail. So the Demons are a cool villain for a serial, and as mentioned, using their presence to explain witchcraft rituals is something we haven't seen before. The biggest problem I have with the Demons though is that Azal doesn't do much, with him not appearing fully for quite some time, and then once he has, he basically stands around terrorising the Master when he summons him. Now that does work for a godlike villain, with him not being overly used or explained, which could take away from him, but I've never really found Azal very compelling when he's on screen, with me not really being able to say anything about him, as he's not really a character and more an oncoming threat. Now given the story is about how humans have taken the advanced science of the demons and turned it into rituals, it does make sense that the daemon itself would be more minimal in the story, but I think that when Azal is on screen, he's not used effectively enough to make me have an interest in him. Now let's talk about the Master himself and his plans. Now I've already addressed the Master's presence in the village, but haven't talked much about his plans, which are obviously for world domination, because even after 5 serials he hasn't changed this up at all. On the Master's plan, he wants to summon Azal so he can take his power and destroy humanity, then presumably any other planet. So it's a simple enough plan, but like with most other serials so far, he doesn't prepare for how powerful Azal is and is nearly destroyed. But even once he knows how powerful Azal is, Azal wants to meet the Doctor, as he can sense him, and when they do eventually meet, sees him as the worthy one and so plans to give the Doctor his power. But he refuses, and so Azal just changes his mind and goes to pass it over to the Master. It's a bit of a bizarre series of events as to how the Master goes around to getting the power, as he feels like such a minor presence against Azal's power that he really has no agency when they confront each other. This doesn't mean that the Master isn't interested in the serial, but after an entire season of him doing the same thing, it's just not as engaging as it should be. Notably though, this is the serial where the Master is finally captured after a season of escapes, with him trying to escape in Bessie, but due to the Doctor recently upgrading her with a remote control feature, the Master is unable to escape. It feels really good to know this overarching plotline is finally over, because this idea had already run its course in this season, let alone if it had continued into another. Let's move on to the last few characters, beginning with Jo. So the serial is a lot more of a middle ground for her, with her feeling closer to her characterisation in The Mind of Evil, but without the setting allowing her to show off her skills and stronger personality traits. This does mean that we get a stronger version of Jo who is less scared, but the setting does restrict her ability to be useful and show off her traits. On the other hand though, it is Jo who defeats Azal in the end, with her standing between him and the Doctor so Azal can't kill him. This causes Azal to explode because it wasn't something he was expecting. So while this is a really cool ending, it just sort of happens without any proper setup. I do find it annoying the way it just wraps up just so suddenly, with it being explained after the fact, but I like the idea of it. Jo's selfless act is what destroys the Devil character, but it needed some proper setup, as I always forget why Azal blew up until it's explained afterwards. The Doctor I don't have much to say about, as it would just be me repeating myself from the rest of this season, as he's been very consistent, but this serial does give him some strong moments, notably involving his complete lack of ability to accept the idea of magic, as he can explain it or is able to rationalise the fact that there is some sort of scientific explanation. We also have some more of his tinkering with Bessie at the beginning, and that's what prevents the Master's escape at the end, but it also allows for some comedy when he confuses both Jo and Yates with his upgrades. There is actually a lot of comedy in this serial, with the Doctor having several moments. Notably we have the Bessie stuff at the beginning, but the scene where he tries to escape being burnt alive by pretending to be a wizard is the greatest of his humorous moments. We even get another false name for the Doctor, which has Who in it, but in another language, as the name made up for him by Miss Hawthorne's is Qui Qui Quod, which is Latin for who what. So we have one or two behind the scenes things to talk about, but we'll start with the colorisation as per usual. Episode 4 survives as the original colour 2-inch videotape, but the remainder of the episodes had to be colorised with the same method with the Silurians, by combining the image signal and the colour signal of 2 different copies. One interesting thing is the gargoyle, or Bok, and I'm surprised I haven't mentioned him by name by now. So I want to address the prop itself, as the prop would end up in the hands of John Pertwee and his son Sean Pertwee, as once production was done they took it home with them and it turned into a garden ornament. This also won't be the last time that we talk about Pertwee taking props home. So The Daemons is a serial with a very good reputation, with being seen as one of the best of the early 70s and the Pertwee era, with most of the people who worked on it calling it their favourite. I do like the ideas it presents and I do find it fun, but it's never really clicked with me, as well as others have in this season, and it definitely suffers from the Master problem, which is definitely dragging it down for me. Perhaps if I were to watch it by itself I wouldn't be as bothered by this, but I ultimately think this is a great serial, but it's not a favourite of mine.